Moving on to Dinah, and then we'll introduce you and let you do your opening statements.
Okay, well, Ed has given an argument for the separation of church and state, and later on, Lee, I'll get a chance to comment on it. But I wanted to address the question directly, which is, can we have a separation of church and state? And before I can answer that, I'd like to, if you'll indulge me, take a moment to define the terms we're using, so you'll know what I'm talking about. Unfortunately, the terms state, society often get intermingled. I'm going to assume that this group knows the difference between state and society, and therefore will understand that the comments I'm about to make now have to do with separating church from state, not from separating it from society. But when we get to the other side of the equation, the terms church, faith, religion often get used interchangeably, even though I think they're very distinctive. So I'm going to tell you how I'm going to use them. When I talk about church, I am talking about a formal institution. And when I talk about society, I'm talking about an informal matrix of associations that takes place. And when I talk about culture, I'm going to be talking about something that, again, spontaneously arises through the interactions of all kinds of input factors. Now, with that definition, let's turn to the question of, can you separate church from state? Absolutely. And I can think of at least 3 ways that you can absolutely separate church from state. The first is the anarchist solution: you have no state. No problem. The second solution would be this anti-establishment solution: you have no church, and therefore there would be no solution. And of course, the corollary of those two would be you have neither a church nor a state, and that would solve the problem also. But there's a third method, and it is the method that I think is appropriate to bring this up here at the Fund for American Studies, is I think the purpose of the American experiment, to have a system in which there is a wall of separation between those institutions. So you don't have to get rid of the institutions of church and state. You merely keep them completely separated. So that way you can have an absolute separation between the institutions, but it does not in any way require a separation between religion and politics, or religion and society, or faith and society, or faith and politics. These things can continue to exist. And later, I will argue, perhaps as opposed to the implications of my predecessor here, that you don't necessarily want those to be separated.
Okay, so we've got yes, a kind of, but we've got to use different definitions. And then...
what was the question?
Okay. Well, welcome, Hugh. We're glad you made it.
I am glad I made it too.
For introduction, Hugh spent several years, 15 years in the IT industry, and he stepped out of his successful business career to share his executive experience with Reformed Theological Seminary's struggling Washington, D.C. campus, where he served as the executive director. He's the author of a soon-to-be-released book, How Then Should We Work? Rediscovering the Biblical Doctrine of Work. Being a native Floridian, Hugh graduated from the University of Florida and earned a master's degree in theology from Reformed Theological Seminary. He is an ordained ruling elder at the Presbyterian Church in America and serves in leadership at McLean Presbyterian Church in McLean, Virginia, and is the executive director of the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics. We were doing the opening statements on the question of, can church and state ever be truly separated?
I think really to address that, you have to go back and say, what was the one thing that was different in the founding of the United States that was no place else in the world at that time? Go back to 1776, and on the eve of the country becoming a country, and I'm telling you this by secondhand, I wasn't really there. I think I am, but because of all the gray hair. Basically what was happening is that there was this argument that we needed not religious liberty, but religious toleration. And that has pretty much been the peak of the standard of the discussion at that time. And then a young man, can I step forward, named James Madison, and said, no, that's wrong. We don't need religious tolerance. We need religious liberty. And this was a huge step forward. No one had ever talked about religious liberty ever before. And one of the things that concerned the Founding Fathers, and I think this gets lost in the shuffle sometimes, is they were trying to put together this new experiment. And they were concerned about how do you keep people, or how do you get people to do the right thing? If you have a ruler who can use the whip and the rod, he can force people to do the right thing. But in an independent state, a nation like they were trying to put together, you can't do that. And they saw it, religion being very, very important. The idea of a virtuous population was critical in the success of this new founding country. Now, what happens is this idea about religious liberty, once it takes root, it spreads like wildfire. It shows up in all the state constitutions of the time. And 10 years later, it actually shows up in our Constitution and the First Amendment. It becomes the cornerstone of the First Amendment. And I would argue most of the other pieces that flow out of the Constitution, particularly the other amendments, flow from this idea of religious liberty. In other words, to have religious liberty, to be able to keep the government out of the church, and that was really their concern. And once again, if you look at the historical period of the time and what was going on, they did not want the federal government reaching in and manipulating things that were happening in the church. They wanted religious liberty. They believed it was an inalienable right given to them by God. Now, here's the interesting thing. As we fast forward 200 plus years, this whole idea of particularly the First Amendment, which was basically written to keep religion out of, to keep federal government out of religion, has been turned on its head. And now we hear things like the wall of separation, and we can talk about this later. I think there's quite a misunderstanding of what Jefferson was originally trying to apply when he used that term. And now we're using the First Amendment to keep religion out of the federal government, which was never intended to do. I think that our Founding Fathers would be absolutely horrified because they saw it as one of the major, most important things to be able to have a people who had strong moral direction, and they believed that the easiest way to get that was through religion. Not necessarily Christian religion, but religion in general. And I think it's very important for us to begin to think about what does that look like in the 21st century.
Okay, great. Now that we had the opening statements, I'm going to be asking a few questions. Again, you want to tweet a question, use the hashtag AFFRT, which stands for AFF Roundtable, and we'll be taking some questions from Twitter, and then we also had some experts send in questions who aren't able to be here, so we'll be interspersing some expert questions, and finally taking questions directly from the audience at the end. Let's see, does anyone want to initially respond to something that someone else said in their opening statements? First of all, did you mention something?
Just a comment on what you had said. I think that what was really unique about the American experience with this issue is the concept of disestablishment. Because there were cases of what I would consider to be religious liberty before that, as far as free exercise of religion is concerned. But I think the United States was not only the first country to be established without a state religion, but also, to this day, I would say is the only country without a state religion. I don't consider the atheist states to have been without a state religion. Their state religion was atheism. And I don't consider France, with its form of secularism, to be without a state religion, because in France, secularism is the state religion.